This evening, as you can see, we are learning about the geography, history and archaeology of biblical Cyprus. And of course you can see there on the first slide, there's just one picture of a place in Cyprus that I saw, and we'll get to there here in a few moments. But biblical Cyprus, of course, a while back I was in Malta and we learned much the same about Malta, about its geography, its history and archaeology, but now we're going to learn a little bit about Cyprus. So what can we learn? Well, in this lesson I will give a brief overview of the geography, history and archaeology of Cyprus during the biblical era. And so that's roughly the time period from prehistory, in other words, before any written record on the island of Cyprus. So that's all prehistory means. It literally means before the time of writing was found on Cyprus. And there was a period when there is no known writing system that we know of on the island of Cyprus. But obviously there were people living there and they had their lives and things were going on. But because it's not written down, we don't really know much about it. So we have to try to piece it together. So from the prehistory all the way to the end of the 1st century AD. Now of course Cyprus has more history after that. The latter part of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Muslim period, the Crusaders, all the way in fact up to the modern state of Cyprus. And so there's plenty more history beyond the 1st century, but of course the Bible ends towards the end of the 1st century AD. So, we're not going to go into that. So if you want to, you can look it into yourself. But we're just going to have a brief overview. So I'm just going to skim through some of the more important details that relate to biblical Cyprus. Now, of course, one of the important questions to ask is, where exactly is Cyprus? Now, hopefully if I gave you a blank map today, and you would be able to point out where it is on a blank map. But if you don't, now you know. Well, there, on the slide there is of course Cyprus on the eastern end of the Mediterranean. Now if you're interested, Cyprus is the 3rd largest island in the Mediterranean in both size and then also today in population. So that's modern day population. Of course we can't be sure how many people were living on the island during biblical times, but today it's still the 3rd biggest in size, and today it's the 3rd biggest in population. And as you can see, it's located at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, so in the area we would call the Levant. The Levant is the area between Egypt all the way to southeastern Turkey, so you can see that region there. So if anyone says the Levant, that's roughly the area of the Holy Land and the surrounding areas. So it's located 40 miles south of the coast of Turkey. So of course there's the modern state of Turkey. There's Cyprus. It's 60 miles west of Syria, modern state of Syria, and 250 miles north of Egypt. So it's in a very important place geographically. And we're going to see that impacted the importance of this island. So it's not the biggest island in the Mediterranean. It's not the smallest, but it was a very important place during the biblical period, as we're going to see. So there is Cyprus. So if you didn't know where it was, now you know. Now the island itself contains 2 large ranges of mountains. Now not the biggest in the world, but compared to some places they're pretty big. Now the 2 main mountain ranges can be found in the southern part of the island and in the northern part of the island. The largest is here, you can see on this photo from satellite image. You can see the southern mountain range is called the Troodos Mountains. And by far, as you can see there, the biggest range of mountains in the island. And of course, it's very hilly all around to the south, going down to the coast. And then between that, you have relatively flatter land between the 2 mountain ranges. And in the north, you have the smaller mountain range, the Kyrenia Mountains. So 2 mountain ranges. There's roughly there's a large plain-like area between them, still hilly, not totally flat, but relatively speaking a lot smoother, and of course relatively flat land towards the south, as you can see on this picture. So it gives you a good idea how the island is laid out. And as you can see, there's also plenty of natural bays and places by the coastline, which will be handy, as we're going to see later on, for shipping. So, now, this is Limassol, or Limassos, in southern Cyprus, roughly the area where I was staying. Now, it's a bit hard to see the mountains here, but this is looking, of course, to the north, and you can see some of the mountains over there at the back there, so you can just about see them. So they're not massive, they're not like the biggest mountain range you're going to see in this world, but they're quite significant, even compared to here, say, in Ireland, where most mountains are more like just big hills, compared to other places. But that's the Troodos Mountains off in the distance. And of course, Cyprus being a Mediterranean area, it has a Mediterranean climate and all that goes together with that. So compared to our weather here, it's much more reliable, much more dependable. I was there in November, and they were still having 24 degrees Celsius temperatures in November, sunny days, a few rain showers, a few thunderstorms. Actually, they apparently had a small earthquake when I was there too, and I didn't even notice it happened. So I didn't even notice it. So I can say that I survived an earthquake, which I didn't even know about. But anyway, so this is actually going up towards the Troodos Mountains. So you can see here, this is, of course, you go to the Mediterranean and you see, of course, vineyards or growing of grapes, of course, all over the place. You also, of course, they grow olives and other such plants there. But it's a very hilly country, not perfectly flat, but some mountainous. Of course, you get all of the staples of the Mediterranean there, like the growing of grapes and olives and so on and so forth. So it's a very pretty place, and it was very pleasant when I was visiting there. And of course, you see here, this is actually where the monastery we were visiting while we were there, up in the middle of the Troodos Mountains, just to the north of Paphos. And of course, it just gives you an impression of what the place is like. So in November, it's not too bad. That's like a beautiful summer's heat wave day in Ireland. And so it's a lovely place there in Cyprus specifically. So of course, Cyprus, modern Cyprus, is an Orthodox country, and of course everything that goes together with that. And of course here we're going to see, this is a picture from Korea, and you can see the coastline over there. So it's not all mountainous, it's not all hilly, some is flat. You can see of course the fields and the Mediterranean. This is of course looking southwards on the southern side of the island. So it just gives you an impression of what the place is like. Because the thing is, when you go to these places, you may have an idea of what they're like from reading the Bible. And the Bible is not a geography book. It doesn't necessarily go into detail as to what the places look like. And sometimes we get a misconception as to what places are like. And then when you go to them, you realise, oh, that's not what I thought it would have looked like. So you can see Cyprus, there's a lot of variety there for a relatively small place. But today, the modern state of Cyprus, and I only mention this because it's quite interesting compared to other countries, but politically, the modern day Ireland has since 1974 been divided between the southern Greek Cypriots and the Turkish-controlled north. And of course there's, as you can see on this map here, you see that there's a buffer area. That's a buffer zone between the north and the south. Now, they're not at war or anything, but since that happened, there has had to be a buffer zone between the Turkish north and the Cypriot south. And it actually goes straight through the modern day capital of Nicosia. So there's Nicosia. So the main cities in Cyprus today, in southern Cyprus anyway, is Nicosia, Larnaca, Limassol, and Paphos. Now, of course, that's going to be important for the Bible later on, Paphos. But Nicosia is actually still a divided city, because when everything took place in 1974, the city was divided in two, between the Turkish north and the Cypriot south. And there is literally a thin buffer zone that goes through the city. Now you can pass over from north to south, it's relatively easy. You just go through a passport check on both sides and it's fine. But it's a divided city politically. one side is controlled by the Turks, the southern side is controlled by the Cypriots. And it's the last divided city out there, divided between two different nations. In fact, you go there and you see, if you go through Nicosia, I went there, it was fine, but you notice here, this is the start of the buffer zone. So this is on the southern side of Nicosia, the Cypriot controlled side, and you can see here these walls in the middle of the streets. Literally the city was divided between streets and buildings. So you can notice here, if you were to go past this wall, which you shouldn't go past it because it's a buffer zone, they'd probably shoot you for it. In fact, in some places, they have guard posts, and if you'd even take a picture of it, they're shouting and yelling at you, put your camera away. But literally, there's a gap between the northern part and the southern part, and it's been deserted since 1974. And it's patrolled by the UN. And how can you know that? Well, you can see all the blue and white. And you can see here, of course, you see the Greek flag and the Cypriot flag, but on the northern side of the buffer, it's controlled by the Turkish Republic. So that's how it is in Nicosia today. You can go through it, no probs, but it is a divided city, and it's no closer to being rejoined together. Now, in biblical times, Nicosia was not the capital, it wasn't even there at that time, so how things change. But I just point this out, because it's an interesting fact in relation to the modern day state. Now, in ancient times, during the Greek period, the island was divided into several kingdoms. And so the island has been divided in the past, and it's still divided to this day. But that's only a little bit about modern day politics. Of course, we're here not for modern stuff, we're here for biblical stuff. And so we're going to learn a little bit about the history of Cyprus. Now, this is only going to be a brief run through as to relates to important, significant things. So we can't go into detail. There's an awful lot you could go into, but for time's sake we can't. But this island has a rich history during the biblical period, not surprisingly, and was inhabited or controlled by many different peoples and cultures and empires. Now, before the Mycenaeans, there were already people living on the island. As we're going to see, the Bible, I believe, even mentions that. But one of the major groups was, later on in the Bronze Age, was the Mycenaeans, or ancient Greeks. So really ancient Greeks. Then the Phoenicians, of course the Phoenicians were from Lebanon, modern day Lebanon. They were Canaanite people, of course the Bible mentions the Phoenicians, the men of Tyre and Zidon and so forth. The island was also for a time controlled and influenced by the Assyrians. After that the Egyptians, then by the Persians, then by the Greeks during the Hellenistic period, and then up until the 1st century, and even beyond that, the Romans controlled the island. So you can see for such a little place, there's an awful lot of different stuff going on. Different cultures, different peoples living in the island or controlling it. So you have the early Bronze Age peoples, Mycenaeans, Phoenicians, Assyrians, Egyptians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and then there's much more even after that. And so, as you can see some of the pictures here, these are from the earlier times in the early Bronze Age of Cyprus. And of course you see some very strange figurines. Like one of the famous things Cyprus is known for its early history, is these cruciform or cross-shaped figurines. Why are they shaped like that? Well, they don't really know, but they're for a time very, 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 very popular in the island of Cyprus. In fact, here you see a pottery, a sort of like a replica of a sanctuary, a religious sanctuary made of pottery and from clay, which you can see has got bull's heads on the top of it, and there's someone making an offering down there. And here, when I saw this, and it just looked like a really ancient Mr. Potato Head. That's what it looked like to me. So that could be the very first Mr. Potato Head, but anyway. So well, we don't know, but just shows you they knew what they were making. Sometimes we haven't got a clue. What does this represent? What does that represent? Well, someone knew, but apparently we don't. Anyway, here's some more of those cruciform figurines. So you can see there's many different types of them. They're made in different materials, stone, pottery, many different sorts of things. Why are they like that specifically? We don't know. The people who made them know, but we don't. And also think, just to let you notice all these things are standing upright, and you go to a museum and you think, oh look, they're standing up. They can't naturally stand up. In fact, they'd be more like that. So when you go to a museum, they want to display them in a nice, decorative, attractive way. And so apparently these were not designed to be stood up. They were designed to be laid down. But of course that doesn't look very pretty in a museum or very attractive. And so that's why they probably lay one down, just to show you what they're like. But these were found all over the island. What do they all represent? They don't entirely know. You can see here some different forms of pottery from the earlier Bronze period. In Cyprus, you see many different containers of different shapes and sizes. Of course, you can see here some like little cow or bull figurines, different, almost looks like little ladles, different pots, different containers. Obviously, they were very skilled in what they were doing. It shows you they were artistic even from earliest times. But there are a variety of different peoples and cultures present on the island over time is based on a couple of important factors. You may say, well, why was this island had so much different cultural influences and people living there? Well, there's some very obvious reasons. Firstly, its location near the crossroads between Europe, Asia and Africa made it important. Now remember, we saw earlier on, Cyprus is right there on the crossroads of three major continents. And that in and of itself makes it a very important place. Just as the nation of Israel strategically was located at a very important place on the crossroads between Europe, Asia and Africa. And so that gives it a lot of advantages. It was also a natural stopping off point for ships sailing the Mediterranean. And, from earliest times, men have been sailing the Mediterranean from east to west to north and south. And so it's a logical place to stop. And so some people will stop to trade, some people will just stop to get supplies, some people may stop there to live, or a variety of reasons. And so that just increases the different cultural influences that were present on the island over the centuries. And in fact, you see here, this pot is a Mycenaean pot from the Mycenaeans from ancient Greece in the latter part of the Bronze Age. And of course, you can see here different things are depicted. You see a couple of guys on a chariot, a horse. You see a guy there, what appears to be a bow and a spear, and different sort of animals. And so they were present on the island, and for obvious reasons. They were a maritime people, and Cyprus was a logical place to stop off and possibly control, so that you can control the movement of people and also resources and trade and so forth. And in fact, here you see some ancient models of ships and boats from Cyprus. So you get an impact here. Sailing was a very important part of the island. You can see there's one here with 3 guys in it. You see another bigger one there with a couple of guys in it. A little one, teeny tiny one there, and another one, and someone's rowing. So it shows you the impact that these people from very earliest times, from the early Bronze Age onwards, were at sea and going back and forth. Because Cyprus needed contact with the outside world, and the only way in those days you could contact the outside world was by sea. So it made them a maritime power. They had to be good at sailing, and they had to be good at navigating the sea and making ships. And we're going to see the Bible even points this out, as we're going to notice here. Now, the island was also, in Old Testament times, specifically earlier Old Testament times, was a vital source of many different resources. So one of the most important being copper. Now, if you mix copper and tin together, you get bronze. And during the Bronze Age, the main material that was used for tools and so on during the Bronze Age was bronze. That's why they call it the Bronze Age. because that's what most tools were made out of, bronze. And so copper is the most important element in the production of bronze. And the island was abundant with copper. In fact, many different mines were found in the Troodos Mountains on the island of Cyprus, and it became known for its mining and production of copper, which would lead to the production of bronze. Like I said, copper is the main component in the production of bronze, which was highly valued and utilised in the Bronze Age and beyond. Now later on, the Iron Age came about and people started using iron more than bronze, but bronze was still used. It was used in many different things. It just was not the main metal that was used for tool making. Iron had replaced it because iron was easier to make, and it was easier to find the materials to make it with, and also it was just more durable than bronze. But yet bronze was still common, often used in more decorative avenues, like statues and so forth. In fact, the name Cyprus is thought to have originated from the bronze that was found on the island. Now, that's the most common understanding of its name. Other people have speculated otherwise, but it seems logical. If there was so much copper on the island, why not in essence call the island Copper Island? There was loads of it. In fact, you see here, this is an example of a Bronze Age cauldron. It's a massive thing there. So made out of bronze. In fact, here you see, this is what we would call an ox hide ingot. Now you wonder, well, when they made these bronze or copper, how did they transport it? Well, what they do is they smelt it down and put it into molds like this. So they melt it down. And why do they call it an ox hide ingot? Because it's roughly shaped like what an ox hide would be once you take it off the ox and you tan it. So an ox hide ingot. And so if you see one of them, you know that's from the Bronze Age, because that's how they stored and transported it. And in fact, you can see the importance of the production of copper and bronze in Cyprus. Is you see this image here, which appears to be of some sort of deity. You can see the horns on its head. It's got a helmet, it's got a spear, and it's got a little shield. You notice what it's standing on? It's standing on an ox hide ingot. And so they call it the ingot god, because it appears to be connected with the production of bronze and copper on the island. And of course, here's a larger statue in bronze of a horned, apparently, deity. So it was a very important resource for Cyprus for generations through the Bronze Age and even beyond it. Now, the island also has a strong connection with the goddess of love, Aphrodite or Venus. Now, Aphrodite is just the Greek name, Venus is the Roman name for this particular goddess of love, as it was believed that the island was the place of her birth. Now, of course, the birth of Venus or Aphrodite is very strange, but if you want to know, you can go and read it for yourself, like most of the birth stories of the Greek and Roman gods. But she is strongly connected with the island. In fact, a coastal site near Paphos has long been associated with this mythological story. Other gods, such as Baal, were also worshipped on the island over time. And you would say, so where was she born then, apparently? Well, apparently, this is where she was born, on this particular rock close to Paphos. And it was believed that she came up upon that rock after she came out of the sea. Aphrodite, the name means she who was born from the foam. So she came up from the sea, landed on this, and came up onto this rock. And this is literally believed to be the place from ancient times where it believed Venus or Aphrodite was born into this world. So close to Paphos. And so there's the rock there. And of course, one of the reasons they connected Aphrodite with this particular rock is this is black. The rest of the rock around, as you can see, is white. And they must have been wondering, well, why is that big rock black and this is all white? And so maybe they saw that and thought, well, it's got to be connected with something important. And so this is believed to be in mythology where Aphrodite was born, the goddess of love and so on and so forth. And so there, you can visit that site there. And of course other gods and goddesses were worshipped on the island. This is in fact a collection that was found on one site in Cyprus, and you can see it is full of votive offerings. In other words, you leave these offerings behind in honour of a god or goddess for having done something for you. And you can see it's believed that this particular god, this is roughly the time of the Archaic period in Greek history, I think roughly 6th century BC, but they all are very similar. You can even tell all the images look roughly the same. Not exactly, but roughly the same. All found at one particular place of worship on the island of Cyprus. Believed probably to be a god of war and agriculture and so forth. And so how do we know that? Well, the images have armour on, they have weapons. You can see there's bulls represented, there's chariots represented too. In fact, you see here, so all these little votive offerings. You can see the 4-horse chariots down here. So different shapes and sizes, but all are apparently dedicated to the image to one particular god on the island. They also have some strange figurines, like these plank-shaped figurines. Why are they called plank-shaped figurines? Well, because they're shaped like planks. Not very profound, not very complicated, but you can see here, what do these represent? Well, you can see some of them have rudimentary faces, some of them have little arms, either incised on or fabricated onto the sides. Apparently they represent gods or deities or something. We don't know. They're lost. Its purposes have been lost in antiquity. Some of them have apparently represent 2 people, or maybe one deity with 2 heads. We just don't know. So idolatry and the worship of many gods was alive and well on the island. They also have different ways of making these images. Now I just think that one is funny over there. That just reminds me of a gingerbread man. It's an ancient gingerbread man, you see. But this is how they would make little images like this, because, you know, some people needed to buy an image, and why don't you just make a mould? You can make a small image and people can do with it as they will. And so the worship of gods and the even of votive offerings and all of that was very common on Cyprus, well, not surprisingly. You see here as well, you see this is a depiction of Hercules. How do we know it's Hercules? What Hercules has got is, of course, lion robe over him. You can see the little paws there. He's got his club. You can see the head of the lion on his head. This is Zeus the Thunderer. In other words, he's throwing his thunderbolts down. Zeus the Thunderer. And remember, we saw this horned deity made of bronze and what is called the ingot god. So we see many gods were worshipped on this island. Now, the island has also been called in non-biblical sources Alasia, or Alashia, Asi, or Isi. All the same place, just different people calling it different things, but all the same place. Now, this may have come from the island's Bronze Age capital of the same name. So, apparently, at one stage, the island was called this based upon the capital of the island. So, the capital and the island have exactly the same name. Now, in relation to the Old Testament, the island was called Kittim. Now, that's what the Jews called it in the Old Testament period. Now, this name originates after the flood from a son of Japheth, Kittim. So you can sort of see they're very similar. This is the man's name, Kittim, son of Japheth, and the island is apparently named after him. Now, apparently, Kittim inhabited the island along with his descendants as they spread out across the earth. You see that in Genesis chapter 10, verses 2 to 5. So apparently this guy Kittim stopped off on the island. Whether he stayed there and to the end of his days, we don't know, or he moved off. But one way or another, apparently he was there and his descendants inhabited the island and they called it after him. Now the island we know was inhabited from very earliest times. So there's been a population on Cyprus for millennia in the very earliest history of man. In fact, there's a city called Kition which also existed on the island. So there seems to be this connection. In fact, we see here, this is not a picture taken by me, but you see here, this is what we would call the horns of consecration. Now, that's a common image that you find on Crete with the Minoans. They would worship the bull, or at least use the bull in their worship. And you can see what are considered two horns. Now, horns in worship are a pretty common image. In fact, in the Old Testament altars, they'd have horns on the altars. So it's not unknown in different cultures. This is the site of Kition in the modern-day city of Larnaca. Now, this is one of the oldest cities on the island of Cyprus. Apparently, the island may have been named after this particular city. But Kition, so very, very early. Now, the first reference to the island in the Bible is found in Numbers 24:24. Now, of course, the Book of Numbers is written at about the late 15th century BC. So, later part of Moses' life. So, late 15th century BC. And in connection to the island, it makes mention of its ships. So you can turn to Numbers 24:24, and you see it mentions the ships of Kittim, and it also mentions in the same verse the Assyrians. So the idea of ships coming from this island was even known in Moses' day, so they had this strong maritime connection, which isn't surprising. Islands often have a strong connection with the sea because it's the only way to travel beyond your land. And in fact, in Daniel chapter 11 verse 30, the maritime power and influence on the island is also mentioned. So these are just two minor references to biblical Cyprus, but both of them mention in the Old Testament the navies of and the ships of Cyprus. And in fact, here at Kition, at Larnaca, you can see these are ramps that would have been used for boats. Now, the city of Larnaca is by the sea, but the ancient city has moved further and further away from the sea. Or I should say, the sea has moved further away from it, but you get my point. Because land, the sea has eventually filled up areas that were once directly on the coast. But very early time, you see here, a connection with the sea. The clear maritime connection with the island is not surprising, seeing that its people were an island people who relied heavily on the sea for many things. And the first reference to it is relating to its ships. Daniel mentions the power of its ships. So we shouldn't be surprised at this. The Bible knows, I believe, what it's talking about. Now, more importantly, in connection to Cyprus, is found in the New Testament. And Cyprus is mentioned 8 times, all in the book of Acts. So if you're looking for Cyprus in the New Testament, the book of Acts is where you go. Now, Cyprus was the homeland, the Bible tells us, of Barnabas, the son of consolation. In other words, he was, of course, the early companion with Paul. He was an encouraging man. And he came from the island of Cyprus, though where exactly on the island is not known. So Acts 4:36 tell us that Barnabas was from Cyprus. And there was historically a large Jewish population on the island of Cyprus. Now, whereabouts on the island? We don't know exactly. Now, this is the thing, there are many traditions, not surprisingly, in Cyprus about Barnabas and his connection with the island. Why? Well, because Barnabas is the Cypriots' golden boy, their connection with the Bible. And so they have a lot of traditions relating to him, and others in fact. Now, like I said, how do we deal with traditions? Well, firstly, our authority first and foremost is the Bible. Now, if a tradition goes along with what the scriptures teach, then we don't necessarily reject it unless there's good reason to reject it. But if the tradition contradicts what the Bible says, well, what do we side with? we side with the Bible. So take tradition with a pinch of salt. Don't just dismiss it automatically, but think about it. But Barnabas and Saul, who would later become Paul, because remember, he wasn't always called Paul, he was called Saul at first. But Barnabas, Saul, and John Mark visited the island at the start of their first missionary journey. You read about that in Acts 13, verses 4 to 13. And literally that's all the verses that are committed to what they did on Cyprus. So there's a lot of things we don't know what they did, because the Bible doesn't go into exhaustive detail. That's not the point of what it's doing. But the choice to visit Cyprus, why did Barnabas and Saul decide to go there? Was there a big profound reason? Well, probably quite simply, they're thinking of a place to go, thinking, well, Saul, where are we going to go? And at this point, Barnabas is the leader of the group. He's always mentioned first. It's only after Cyprus where Paul starts to be mentioned first, then Barnabas. So, you know, whoever's most important generally gets mentioned first, don't they? Don't they? Yeah, it's true. At the first start of the missionary journey, Barnabas, Saul. Barnabas, Saul. Barnabas, Saul. After Cyprus, Saul, Barnabas. Saul, Barnabas. Why did they go? Well, maybe simply Barnabas is like Saul. Where should we go? Why do we go to Cyprus? Well, why go there? Well, I'm from the island. There's Jews on the island. I know the island. Why don't we go there? Okay, fine. You know, maybe it was just as simple. Of course, they would have been praying about it, thinking about it, but, you know, that's a logical place to go. The leader of the group knows Cyprus, is from there, knows people there. Why not go there and move on from there? So the choice to visit Cyprus was probably heavily influenced by the fact that Barnabas was from the island. And nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. And God had used that. You know, notice how God can use just humdrum common things to get you where you need to be. Maybe that's it. We just don't know. But that may be an influence. Now, of course, here's a map of their first missionary journey. So you see, of course, Antioch is over here. They leave to Seleucia. They get the ship to Salamis on the eastern side of the island. They go to Paphos on the western side of the island, and then they finish the rest of it. So, you know, we're just dealing with Cyprus today. So it's basically here. So they land in Salamis, Paphos, and then they move on. Now, Barnabas and John Mark would return to the island after Paul and Barnabas had part ways over a disagreement as to whether John Mark should accompany them or not. Because remember, John Mark, he left. He left. And we don't know why exactly he left, but apparently some people speculate that it was because John Mark, who was related to Barnabas, may not have been happy that Paul was becoming the boss of the group. He's like, I'm following my uncle here, but now this Saul guy, maybe, you know, my uncle was the boss. Now he's not. It's clear. Right, I'm going. I'm following my uncle, not you. And off he goes. Now later on, of course, there's the big dispute over whether you bring John Mark or not. And Paul's like, no way, I'm not bringing him. And Barnabas says, give him a chance. Paul says, no, I can't have a liability coming with me. If you want to take him, you can, but no. And so they part ways. And of course, the thing is, Barnabas and John Mark, they decide to go back where? To Cyprus. And Paul goes off and continues on elsewhere. Paul also sailed past the island on at least 2 other occasions that are found recorded in Acts 21 verse 3, that's on his way to Jerusalem, and Acts 27 verse 4 on his way to Rome. So you see this here, of course, this is dealing with Paul's third missionary journey, and he sails past the south of Cyprus on his way to Jerusalem. So he just doesn't stop there, he just goes south of the island. Logical place to sail by. Like I said, why was Cyprus so important? Because it's in a good place for sailors to sail by, and thus makes a lot of connections with the entire Mediterranean. Because if you want to sail from north to south or east to west in the Mediterranean, you're most likely going to go by Cyprus. And we see here, Paul sailed right by it, south of the island, to get to Jerusalem. And here we see, when he was going to Rome, and he was taken there, he sails to the north of the island. And of course, they have all the hullabaloo in the middle of the Mediterranean with the storm. They land at Malta, which we learned about a few months back. But that's the main points we know about it. Scripture doesn't say a huge amount about Cyprus. It says a little bit, a lot more than many other places, but not a huge amount. But we do know they visited at least two major cities on the island, Salamis and Paphos. Now, Salamis is located at the eastern end of the island, and Paphos the western end. Now, it is possible, according to Acts 13:6, that they travelled along the southern side of the island, because, relatively speaking, the southern part of the island was more inhabited, and it had a better road network than the northern part. So most of the major cities of the island were located on the south. And you know, when Paul and Barnabas are travelling, they want to go to the major cities where people are at. Didn't mean they didn't want to talk to people out in the country, but it's logical. You know, if you're on a missionary work, where's better to go into a rinky-dinky hamlet in the middle of nowhere, or a big town where you can talk to people? You know, then didn't mean they didn't talk to people out in the country, of course not. But the assumption is, and we don't know for sure, that they probably went by the southern route. Maybe they went by the north, that's fine. You know, we can't be dogmatic, the Bible doesn't tell us. It just says they travelled from Salamis, went through the island to Paphos. Now, if so, they would have passed by and preached in, possibly, cities like Amathus and Corion. Now, they're not mentioned in the scriptures, but there's a lot of things in the Bible that the Bible doesn't mention. But we'll see some pictures of those places. Maybe Paul and Barnabas stopped by them. Maybe Barnabas and John Mark stopped by them later on. Now, the port city of Salamis was where Barnabas and Saul landed on the island. Now, I didn't get to visit Salamis, unfortunately, when I was on the island, but we'll see some stuff here that is there from other sources. Now, in Paul's day, it was the most important maritime city in Cyprus during the New Testament period, though it was not the capital of the island. Now, it had been at one stage, but it wasn't in the Roman period. That honour went to Paphos. Now, all that Acts 13:5 states about their visit to the city is that they preached to the Jews in the synagogues there before moving on. One verse, that's it. We don't know what else they did. How long? How many people? We don't know. Now here you see here, if you were to go to Salamis, you see what is believed to be the site of the traditional tomb of Barnabas. Now we don't know what happened to Barnabas. The last we know from the Bible really tells us is that when he went with John Mark to Cyprus, it doesn't tell us where he died. Now this is a tradition. Why would they believe that? Well, because the Cypriots are very proud of Barnabas' connection with their island. He was one of the homeboys. And so there is a lot of traditions relating to biblical characters and individuals in Cyprus. Barnabas, even Lazarus, apparently, went to the island. So, you know, you've got to take it with a pinch of salt. Could he have died on the island? It's possible. He had to die at some point, somewhere. Where, we don't know. Could it be on Cyprus? Yeah, it could be. We can't just dismiss it out of hand. But the Bible doesn't tell us. So, you know, just hedge your bets. But anyway, few pictures. This is what's left of the port of Salamis. Doesn't look like much. You'd walk by it and you think, oh, what's that? It's a beach and a few rocks. But it was at Paul's day one of the busiest harbours in the eastern Mediterranean. Now, it's just a beach. Not much there. This is what's left of a Roman gymnasium in the site of Salamis. You see a few statues, a few columns, a few marble, you know, typical things you see at any sort of Roman archaeological site. Some mosaic floors, you know, very typical. Here's a theatre. You know, you go to any decent Roman-sized city worth its salt, you're going to see a theatre. Each of them is so fantastic. Now, they're not much different to one another, but this is the theatre of Salamis. So really, the Bible only mentions it very briefly. And so here's just a more detailed map of some of the archaeological sites in Cyprus. And so Salamis is here, and you notice that most of the major sites are around the south. Doesn't mean there's none in the north, but apparently there are more in the south than in the north. Now, Salamis, so if Paul and Barnabas were travelling to Paphos to the south, they'd go along here. They go by Amathus, or Amathus. They go past Kurion. They go past Old Paphos. Now, just to not confuse anyone, there are actually two cities of Paphos on the island of Cyprus in biblical times. There was Old Paphos and New Paphos. Now, the Paphos mentioned in the scripture is the new one. There's a history to the old one, but by the New Testament period, it's the new city of Paphos. That's important. So they would have gone by here, most likely, I would guess. And just some pictures of the place. This is the remains of the city of Amathus, or Amathos. As you can see right beside the sea, it was a major port town in southern Cyprus. This is what's left of the Roman Forum, or the Greek Agora. So what's an Agora? What's a Forum? Well, they're just one and the same. There's a few minor differences, but the Greeks called them the Agora, and the Romans called it a Forum. Now, to call it a Roman Agora doesn't make sense. It's a Roman Forum. Or to say a Greek Forum doesn't make sense. There's actually a couple of signs like that, and it's like, oh, you know when you get nerdy, when you say, actually, that's not right. But this is the remains of some of it. Now, this is looking down, so this is on the Acropolis, or the hill where the important part of the city was located. That's down there. So there's that forum. You can see off into the distance going westwards. On top of this Acropolis, the hill that the city was situated on, this is Limassol. So I was staying over there. My hotel is just off in the distance there. But this was a temple to Aphrodite on top of the hill. And it took not a hard walk, but a bit of a walk to get up. So the remains of the temple of Aphrodite, or Venus, and these massive stone containers that were situated at the temple there. So maybe Paul and Barnabas stopped by here. Maybe John Mark and Barnabas stopped by here and preached. It was one of the major cities at the time, so there's a high likelihood. Then there's Kurion, which was further west. You can see the remains of this house here from the Roman period. Of course, you see mosaics. That's, common floor decoration during that time, right beside the sea. This is one of the little theatres here, overlooking the sea. So Kurion. This is, of course, where the original picture comes from. So Paphos is over there, off further in the distance. This is the remains of a basilica church building from the Christian period in the city of Kurion. But the Bible doesn't mention them. Our focus is on what the Bible says. But the city of Paphos, that was located at the western end of the island, acted as the Roman capital of the island during the New Testament period. So that's New Paphos, not Old Paphos. So just to remind you of that. Now, in Acts 13, 6-12, it was in this city that God, through Saul, who would then be named Paul, blinded the Jewish false prophet Bar-Jesus, or Elymas, and where Paul led the Roman governor of the island, Sergius Paulus, to the Lord. They then leave the island from him, and as far as we know, Paul never returns to the island. Maybe he did, but the Bible doesn't record it. It doesn't tell us if he did or didn't. So Paphos. Now, just a point here, you may say Sergius Paulus, was he an important guy? Yeah, he was the Roman governor. He was a proconsul. He had been given authority by the Senate to rule as governor over the island. Now, is there evidence for this guy Sergius Paulus outside of the Bible? Well, yes. The Roman governor of Cyprus is well attested to in the archaeological record. Coins have been found in Cyprus with his name, and 2, possibly 3 inscriptions have been discovered that mention him. these have been found in Cyprus, Rome, and Antioch. Possibly Antioch, because some people speculate. But so some may say, look, that might be a different Sergius Paulus. Well, it's possible, but there's others that are quite clearly dating to the time of the governor of the island, Sergius Paulus. This one was found in the north of the island of Cyprus, and if I'm correct, this one was found in Antioch, which is really only a short trip away from Cyprus. Another was found in Rome, near the river Tiber, and so of course Sergius Paulus was a Roman and he was a governor. He wouldn't have lived on the island for the rest of his life. Interesting point, and a point I believe personally. Why did Saul change his name to Paul? Well, I believe it happened, and this is my personal opinion, if I were to tell us why, but notice it's after Paul leads Sergius Paulus to the Lord that he is called Paul. And notice that the governor's name is Paulus, or Paulus, or Paul. So I think what probably happened is people were impressed. Wow, Saul, you led the governor of the island, the Roman governor, to the Lord. Hey, I think you need to be called Paul from now on. Because there's very few people who can say they will ever be able to do that. And that was his nickname. So he's called Paul. Of course, it's very similar to Saul too. So that's just a possibility, because notice after this incident, boom, he's called Paul, and the name stuck. And we know him as Paul more than we do Saul. Now, of course, one is a Hebrew name, one is, of course, a Greek or Roman name, but that's just an interesting thought. So this is just at Paphos, so looking out over towards the coast. You see the Troodos Mountains are in the distance here, so that gives you a better feel of what they're like. But the site of biblical Paphos is huge, and most of it has not been excavated. So it's massive. There's so much that could be done there, which may take centuries to do, which is waiting for time and money and the people to do it. So they'll be kept busy for a long time. But you see here, this is a picture of the Greek Agora, or the Roman Forum in Paphos. You can see here, this is a picture of the Odeon. So it's not a theatre. An Odeon was where they would perform, where they would sing. And rather than a theatre. How do we know the difference? Because an Odeon would have a roof over it. Theatres would not have a roof over it necessarily. Of course, better for the acoustics and so on, I'm led to believe, But an Odeon. And they're all pretty similar in design, but Odeons have a roof, which is better for singing and musical performances. Theatres do not. But you say, well, why is there a lighthouse there? Well, because there was a good place to build a lighthouse years ago. Yes, an archaeological site, but you don't want ships sinking near it, do you? And it's a treacherous place. So yeah, you can. It's funny, you can always tell some pictures. You see a unique feature, and if you see that white lighthouse, then oh yeah, that's Paphos. How do you know? White lighthouse, Greek and Roman stuff, got to be Paphos. But yeah, so of course that's not Roman or Greek. So. But you see here, this is of course the Forum, the Agora, the Odeon. There's actually a temple to the healing god Asclepius right beside it. This is a closer up picture of the restored Odeon and the lighthouse there. This is from top of the Odeon, looking out over the modern city of Paphos and the Troodos Mountains. And so there's the Agora, the Forum, and so you can see they're actually excavating it to this very day. Now this is actually on the other side, you see the lighthouse there. This is the remains of a large house, a very large house, a mansion, and it's referred to as the house of Theseus. And so why? Because of course they found a mosaic in this house with the slaying of the Minotaur by Theseus. And you can see here, there's actually a Minotaur here and he's killing him. And so that's why they name it. Now we don't know exactly who lived in this house, but it was very large. And because it's very large and obviously was very expensive, well decorated place, some of the assumption is that it might have been the house of the governor. It might have been, we don't know. Just because you have a large expensive house does not mean it's the governor's. But Paphos was the seat of the governor, of the island, and so maybe this was the place. We just don't know for sure. This is part of the remains of that large house, so it is relatively massive compared to other houses. More pillars. You see here, of course, decorative mosaics. There's a very large house there called the House of Dionysus, with many well intact surviving mosaics. There's plenty of them. It's famous for it. But it just shows the wealth and the importance of the city. And here, I just point this out, this is further away from that, a little bit further inland. But as you can see, there's a church off there in the distance. But this is traditionally believed to be the site now where the Cypriots believe that Paul was flogged on the island of Cyprus. Now, the thing is, does the Bible say that he was flogged on the island of Cyprus by the Romans? No, it doesn't. Now, it does say in the Bible he was flogged by the Romans. 39 lashes. But it doesn't say where he was. Now, that could have been anywhere. But in Cyprus, they believe that this was the place where Sergius Paulus lived. This is tradition. And they say that it was this pillar that he was tied up to and he was flogged by the Romans. Now, the thing is with that, you may say, well, yeah, it looks about the right size for someone to be tied to. But you notice there's other columns of the same colour and make. This was probably just a decorative column in a house that then some people decided, well, we know Paul was flogged, so why wouldn't he be flogged here? And so, yeah, say, well, how do we know? Well, it's got a little sign there saying. It's got to be true. Well, you see, that's the point. That's tradition. Could he have been flogged on the island? It's possible, but the Bible doesn't indicate it. And this is just tradition. So that's where, like I say, with tradition, you take it with a pinch of salt. Don't just automatically dismiss it, but don't just automatically accept it. Think about it. Sometimes it might be right. Sometimes you're not sure. Sometimes you're just like, nah. So, take it with a pinch of salt. So, that's Paul's pillar, where he was whipped, apparently. And so, but, maybe not. We just don't know. So, can't be dogmatic, so I'm not going to be. Simple. But anyway, so, I know this has been a bit, but we're finished. But in conclusion, we have learned just a small bit about the geography. So, where the island is, what it's like, some of its history, and also the archaeology of Cyprus during the biblical era, and how it relates to and helps to support what is recorded in God's Word in both the Old and the New Testaments. And so I hope that's been of some help, so that when you're reading about Cyprus in the Old or New Testament, I know it's not a lot, but that when you read it and you think about it, you can think about some of these things. And it will give you a better understanding of the geographical context, historical context, and the archaeological context. Because these are things that they would have known about, but we don't always know about, and we need to study and look into and try to keep in mind. Because they would have known a lot of this, but we might not. And so it just helps in our understanding and appreciation of God's Word. So we are finished.